This is the second presentation on the differences between the way adults speak to infants in the US and the UK and how these differences might be or might not be important. So in this presentation we'll be talking about a possible relationship between speech segmentation in infants. I'll tell you about what that is in a moment, and the way parents talk to infants in the UK and in the US. So what is speech segmentation in infants? Speech segmentation is a skill. It's the ability to recognize words in running speech. So how do we test it? We play infants a recording with continuous speech in it. And one word recurs many times in that speech. So here's an example. The doctor saw you the other day. He's much younger than the old doctor. I think your doctor is very nice. He showed another doctor your picture. That doctor thought you ate a lot. Maybe someday you'll be a big doctor. So this is a passage that's been used in these kinds of tasks. And if the babies afterwards show us that they recognize the word that occurred many times in this passage, and in this case that word is doctor, then what we say is that the infants managed to segment doctor out of the running speech, because although they heard it in a continuous stream of speech, they actually recognized that there were some small units, basically words, that recurred many times in that speech. And they then recognized those units when they're produced outside of that passage as isolated words. Previous studies have shown that American, Dutch, and Canadian French infants can segment words out of running speech by the age of 7.5 to 9 months. So American infants can do it at 7.5 months. Other children learning other languages can do it by 9 months. They can do it when the words they are hearing have the dominant stress pattern in their language. So for English, that would be words that have a strong stress at the beginning, words like basket, kingdom, Hamlet. And for Canadian French, it would be words that have a stress at the end of the word. So words like canard, chapeau. So we wanted to find out whether British kids behave like American kids, and would they be able to segment words from running speech at 7.5 months, like the Americans' babies do. So for that, we tried to replicate some findings from the US in York as a baseline to start from. We used stimuli recorded by colleagues of ours, Nazi and his colleagues, who used a southern British speaker who recorded the same stimuli that we heard before, the same kind of passage with the doctor passage and others like it. And amazingly, infants in York could not segment words from the passages that we played to them, not at 7.5 months, not at 9 months, and not even at 10.5 months. So in that sense, they were different from all of the infants learning the other languages we mentioned before. So that seemed maybe like we are getting evidence that British children lag behind American children in the early stages of language acquisition. And we did have some weak evidence for a possible lag between British and American kids from other sources. So in our own studies, when we recorded adults speaking to their children at home in the US and the UK, the children in the US sample started to use words a little bit earlier than the children in the UK sample, but these were small samples, and so we couldn't really trust that kind of evidence. And in addition, when parents are given tick sheets to tick which words their babies know, American parents report that their children know more words than British parents. However, this is not testing the children directly. It's reports made by parents, and it might be that the American parents are just more confident that they know what their babies know, and the British parents are more cautious, for instance. So neither of these pieces of evidence was very strong, but there was maybe a tendency for showing that British kids learn things a few months after the American ones. And in addition, we had read in the paper by Fernald et al. That I talked about in the previous presentation, that American infant-directed speech is more extreme, more different from adult-directed speech than relative to the British infant-directed speech. So we thought maybe these two things go together. Maybe the speech that the infants are hearing in Britain is somehow less exaggerated, and that makes it somehow either less interesting or just harder to segment in some way, and that's why the infants are not managing to segment. So we designed a study to compare the American and the British situations to see if we can find evidence for these differences. So firstly, we recorded the stimuli or the passages again using local speakers with local dialects, both in York and in Virginia in the US, where we ran similar tests with American babies. And here's what the stimuli sounded like.
The chaplain met you the other day. He's much younger than the old chaplain. I think your chaplain is very nice. He showed another chaplain your picture. That chaplain thought you looked quite well. Maybe someday you'll be a big chaplain.
So these were the York stimuli, and here are the Virginia stimuli.
The chaplain met you the other day. He's much younger than the old chaplain. I think your chaplain is very nice. He showed another chaplain your picture. That chaplain thought you looked quite well. Maybe someday you'll be a big chaplain.
And in addition, we also recorded parents speaking to their infants in both locations, in York and in Virginia, to see if what we expected to find, the differences we expected to find in segmentation ability between the children in the two locations, were somehow explained by differences in speaking style by the parents in the two locations. Okay, so we ran another 5 groups. We used different ages. We had them listen to American and British stimuli. We tested them on disyllables, so words with 2 syllables, and monosyllables, which are words with a single syllable. We also tested a group of 8-month-olds in the US just to make sure that we can replicate the results from the US. But none of these groups succeeded in the segmentation, including the US children. And then we discovered that a group of colleagues from Plymouth, Caroline Flocha and her lab, were also trying to run segmentation studies and were getting similar results to ours. So we got together with them and we wrote a paper together with them. And we can see here the list of all the studies that were run in the 2 labs together, altogether 14 experiments with different stimuli, different ages. If you want, you can pause the presentation here and look at the table at your leisure. So none of the groups managed to segment the stimuli besides one. One of the groups in Plymouth managed to segment the passage. This is an example of the type of stimuli that the Plymouth lab used in most of their experiments.
He gave her a carriage clock for Christmas. The carriage was pulled by 2 big white horses. The gentle footman looked after the carriage well. A train pulls a carriage with a lot of people in it.
And here are the stimuli that were recorded especially to be extremely exaggerated. So these were not stimuli that felt natural to the speaker who recorded them, but the speaker was asked to record something extremely exaggerated.
He gave her a carriage clock for Christmas. The carriage was pulled by 2 big white horses. The gentle footman looked after the carriage well. A train pulls a carriage with a lot of people in it.
Okay, that was the only passage that any of the babies managed to segment, and the only group that managed to segment was a group that was quite a bit older than the American infants, who are said to be able to segment such things, so they were 10.5 months old. So, were our hypotheses right? Does that mean that British infants are seriously lagging behind American infants in their ability to segment, and in general, maybe language development in Britain lags behind language development in America in the first stages of language learning? And is that due to the fact that American infants hear a more exaggerated or a more extreme version of infant-directed speech than the British infants? What do we make of this? Does that mean that exaggerated infant-directed speech is superior infant-directed speech? Is that the way we should all talk to our children? Or is there something actually wrong with the segmentation task? So this is something we'll discuss in the workshop. And bear in mind that it's not only that our British samples didn't manage to segment the stimuli, but neither did our American group of children at the same age at which, according to the literature, they should have been able to segment words from running speech. So I'm leaving this as a sort of a puzzle, but the next thing worth looking at and thinking about is something that we found when we started listening to the recordings we made of the parent speech, and that is that infant-directed speech is very, very variable. It's not only different between America and the UK, it's very variable within each location and even within speaker. And actually, the speech that babies hear is just much more variable than what we thought it would be like.